Welcome to The Deep Dive, where we transform complex ideas and dense research into the essential knowledge you need to be truly informed.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are taking a scalpel to one of the most persistent political narratives of the last century, the promise of security through the state.
That's right. Our source material today revolves around Henry Hazlitt's powerful and, often quite severe critique of the modern welfare state. Hazlitt, a towering figure in economic journalism, really challenged the compassionate intentions behind state expansion. He had this single provocative premise that the road to instant utopia promised by politicians, it ultimately leads not to greater security, but to a steady, profound erosion of individual freedom and productivity.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core of Hazlitt's indictment, as I understand it, is that the welfare state, regardless of the noble goals, ending poverty or ensuring full employment, it relies fundamentally on coercion, taking wealth via taxation, regulatory force, and that this act of coercion systematically destroys the necessary foundations of a functioning free society. Is that about right?
Precisely. Our mission today is to trace this central, profound thesis. Hazlitt argues that economic liberty is inseparable from personal liberty. It's not two different things. Once the government assumes massive power to seize and redistribute wealth, to regulate wages, control prices, he asks, where does the individual's independence actually go? We're examining the inescapable consequences Hazlitt predicted when a society replaces, voluntary cooperation, individual thrift, economic discipline with governmental mandates and centralized control.
So coercion replacing freedom, essentially.
In a nutshell, yes. That's the thread running through it all.
Let's begin with the promise itself, then. Hazlitt starts his analysis by framing the context of his writing, noting that the political discourse had been dominated for decades by leaders promising, nothing less than perpetual prosperity, full employment, and the overnight solution to age-old problems like poverty.
Yeah, the sales pitch.
They sold the public a vision of instant utopia.
And this is where Hazlitt, ever the realist, contrasts the political promise with the economic reality. The attempt to fulfill these impossible instant utopias didn't result in stability, not at all.
What did it lead to?
Instead, they led to chronic budget deficits, massive, crushing tax burdens, and perhaps most corrosively, relentless inflation. Just a constant loss in the buying power of ordinary people's wages and savings.
Hazlitt makes a powerful psychological leap here, doesn't he? He connects economic failure to social decay. How does he link the constant loss of buying power to something as severe as cynicism and nihilism among the public? That seems like a big jump.
Well, it's a crucial observation, and I think it speaks to Hazlitt's depth. Think about it. When a government promises you stability, security, a defined future, but then systematically destroys the value of the very money you save and earn,
the trust breaks down.
Exactly. The contract between the state and the citizen breaks down. If hard work is constantly penalized by inflation and taxes, people stop trusting the system. They lose faith in foresight, in thrift. It leads to this general disillusionment, a feeling that, nothing matters and the economy is rigged. That's the breeding ground for cynicism and nihilism he's talking about. Why bother if the game is rigged?
And to make those impossible promises, the government has to get enormous. That concentration of power seems, inevitable if the state claims responsibility for everything.
It is the unavoidable consequence. Hazlitt observed that the attempt to solve every social and economic problem required a gigantic, steady growth of governmental power. It wasn't subtle.
No.
Concentrating authority from the local level all the way up to the executive branch. And this wasn't presented as a temporary measure. It was the new permanent state structure.
He cites someone else on this, doesn't he? To show it wasn't just him.
Right, to highlight the danger. He cited Gustav Cassel, an eminent Swedish economist. Cassel warned, get this, 36 years prior to Hazlitt's book, that a long-continued planned economy requires a bewildering mass of government interferences, which inevitably develops into dictatorship.
A bewildering mass that paints a picture.
It really does. The intervention is like a drug. One mandate requires 10 more just to fix the unintended consequences of the first one. It spirals.
That historical warning connects economic intervention directly to the erosion of political liberty. Okay, but let's delve into the actual mechanics of how this promised prosperity, this utopian spending, is financed. Hazlitt points a direct and frankly unapologetic finger at the engine of inflation. deficit spending, and government debt.
Yeah, this is where we get into the heart of the monetary critique. Hazlitt was writing when Keynesian economics was extremely fashionable, the dominant theory.
Right, the idea that you could spend your way out of trouble.
Exactly. The theory stipulated that depressions were caused by a structural lack of purchasing power, and the fix was deliberate budget deficits, running up debt to prime the pump and inject demand into the economy.
Okay, prime the pump. And the way this deficit spending actually created the new purchasing power. It was more than just simple taxing and spending, wasn't it? It was a mechanism designed to, generate money itself.
Exactly right. The government couldn't simply tax the public more because that would only transfer existing purchasing power around. It doesn't create new demand in that sense.
Okay.
So the deficits were financed not primarily by selling bonds to the public, though they did some of that, but by selling bonds directly to the banking system. The banks, upon purchasing these government securities, would create corresponding deposit credits for the government.
Meaning,
they essentially created new money out of government promises. Poof. New checking account balances for the Treasury.
This is the critical mechanism often obscured in political debates. Hazlitt details a specific technical process involving the Federal Reserve banks that massively magnifies this new money. We need to be crystal clear on this. What does Hazlitt mean by the creation of high-powered money?
Okay, this is where we talk about the fractional reserve system, which is like the engine driving this expansion. When a commercial bank purchases a government bond, it effectively creates a new deposit, as we said.
Right.
But the real leverage, the real multiplication effect, happens when these government securities end up in the hands of the Federal Reserve banks. When they are placed there, they become the basis for new reserves for the entire banking system.
Okay, so the Fed accepts the bond. That bond becomes a reserve asset for member banks. How does that turn $1 into, say, $6? That sounds like magic.
Well, it's not magic. It's purely based on the legally mandated reserve requirements. Historically, banks have only been required to hold a fraction of their deposits as reserves. The source material cites a requirement of about 16.5% against demand deposits during the period Hazlitt was analyzing.
So they only need to keep about 16 cents for every dollar deposited.
Exactly. So if a bank only needs to hold 16.5 cents in reserve for every dollar it lends or creates as a deposit, every $1 of new government securities getting into the Federal Reserve banks can enable the creation of roughly $6 of new money throughout the system.
How?
Through successive lending and depositing by other banks. Bank A gets reserves, lends out most of it. That loan becomes a deposit in Bank B. Bank B keeps a fraction in reserve, lends out the rest. That becomes a deposit in Bank C, and so on. It's a powerful multiplier effect built right into the system and arguably designed for chronic, aggressive expansion of the money supply.
And the consequence of repeatedly using this monetary engine to finance the welfare state, Hazlitt argued, must be chronic inflation. There's no way around it.
It was an arithmetic certainty, he thought, not some unfortunate accident. Hazlitt noted the track record. The U.S. ran 32 budget deficits in 38 years leading up to his writing.
That's quite a streak.
Isn't it? And the statistics he provided were damning. The money supply increased more than fivefold between 1939 and 1969, soaring from $36 billion to $199 billion. Unsurprisingly, consumer prices jumped 164% during that same period.
So a dollar lost well over half its value.
Pretty much. That massive inflation was the inevitable self-inflicted price tag for trying to fund instant utopia through the printing press, or rather through bank credit expansion.
Let's pivot to the debt itself. Hazlitt strongly confronts the popular rationalization for the national debt used heavily since the 1930s, which claimed that it wasn't really a problem because, quote, we owe it to ourselves. You still hear that sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. He dismisses it as a fallacy that's been around for centuries. He actually traces the rebuttal back to the Scottish philosopher David Hume in 1740.
Hume, really?
Yes. Hume pointed out that while the nation collectively owes the debt to itself, the individual taxpayers who fund the debt payments are almost never the same individuals who hold the bonds and receive the interest payments.
Ah, okay. So it's transfer.
It's a transfer. The debt burden is shifted from the, let's say, passive recipients of interest, bondholders, to the active producers who must pay the taxes. Hazlitt argues this hampers production, punishes thrift, and creates this enormous internal friction within the economy.
And he doesn't just see the debt as a transfer of wealth. He sees the inflation used to finance it as an act of fraud against those who saved and lent money to the government. He uses pretty strong language juggling trick and disguised repudiation.
It is a Powerful, morally charged claim. Disguised repudiation means the government isn't outright defaulting on the loan. It's still paying the dollar amount back, technically.
What happens? You get your $1,000 back.
But because it has constantly diluted the dollar's value through inflation, the currency paid back has vastly less purchasing power than the currency originally borrowed. Imagine a bondholder in 1933 lending the government $1,000, a significant sum back then.
Yeah.
Hazlitt calculates that by 1969, the government had effectively repudiated, wiped out the value of 65 cents of every dollar borrowed in 1933.
65 cents.
And 50 cents every dollar borrowed just back in 1945 during the war.
That is a staggering statistic. So if you saved diligently for 30 years, trusted government bonds for your retirement, inflation literally destroyed 2/3 of the real value you lent the state back in 33.
Exactly. Hazlitt insists this is the cruel swindle of inflation. It is a slow, methodical confiscation of wealth, primarily hurting the prudent savers, the elderly, the fixed income earners, the very people who played by the rules.
So the debt only looks smaller relative to gross national product because the measuring stick, the dollar itself, had shrunk so dramatically.
Precisely. It's an enforced, silent transfer of wealth from savers to the state, a coercive act dressed up as economic management, in Hazlitt's view.
So if inflation is the trapdoor the state walks through when funding its promises, what happens when the government tries to patch that hole with more bureaucracy and control? Let's turn to Hazlitt's critique of economic coercion, starting with minimum wage laws. These are always framed as the height of compassion, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They're the archetypal example of Hazlitt's central argument about seeing only the short-term visible effects while ignoring the long-term invisible consequences. The immediate effect seems good, higher wages for some. But Hazlitt sees minimum wage laws as coercive control that inevitably harms the very people they are designed to protect. If a law dictates that an employer must pay more for a service than that service is currently worth in the market, say paying $10 an hour for work only currently producing $7 worth of value for the employer, the inevitable result, he argues, is that the employer eliminates the job.
So unemployment replaces a low wage.
That's the trade-off. You don't make poor people richer by making their labor illegal to hire at the price they could actually get.
This means the most vulnerable, the least skilled workers, they get hit hardest because their entry point onto the job ladder is permanently removed. And the data he cited to prove this unintentional cruelty, it's truly staggering, isn't it?
It is the most heartbreaking data point in this section, I think. Hazlitt showed that between 1952 and February 1968, as the legal minimum wage was continually jacked up, unemployment for white teenagers rose, sure, to 11.6%, which is bad enough. But for non-white teenagers, the unemployment rate soared to 26.6%.
Wow. 1/4 of non-white teenagers, the demographic ostensibly most targeted for assistance, were locked out of the job market by the very laws meant to help them.
That's Hazlitt's conclusion. The policy, driven by, arguably good intentions but ignoring basic economics, effectively subsidized idleness and punished the most marginalized workers. It made it illegal for them to start acquiring skills at a wage the market would actually support. The consequence is devastating for social mobility. You can't climb a ladder if you can't get on the first rung.
Okay, moving beyond labor pricing, Hazlitt critiques the legislative framework that supports compulsory unionism. He viewed acts like the Wagner Act and Taft-Hartley Act as establishing a profoundly coercive and one-sided system. How so?
He argues that the government intervention here completely upends the voluntary nature of employment negotiation. The laws compel employers to negotiate with a specific union, whether they want to or not.
Okay, compelled negotiation.
And critically, he says they grant unions a unique, powerful, special license to keep a plant closed by intimidatory mass picketing. That's his phrase.
So the right to strike morphs into the legal power to physically stop non-union workers from taking the jobs offered, enforced by intimidation, and implicitly backed by the state looking the other way.
Precisely. Hazlitt is adamant that this is the antithesis of free collective bargaining. The government puts its thumb heavily on the T-scale, he believed, intervening on behalf of the striking union, granting them the legal power of coercion to halt production and prevent voluntary association between an employer and a willing replacement worker. This is governmental control over the labor market, plain and simple in his view.
Now we shift to the delusion of trying to solve the inflation the government created by turning to price controls. This seems like an obvious next step for a government trying to hide the effects of inflation.
It's a direct consequence of the inflationary trap, isn't it? You've caused prices to rise, people complain, so you try to suppress the symptom instead of curing the disease. Hazlitt refers to prices as indispensable signals. They are the messengers of economic reality, telling producers, consumers, suppliers the truth about scarcity, supply, demand. All that complex information gets boiled down into a number.
Like a thermostat for the economy.
Sort of, yeah. A vast, decentralized information system. Government price controls, by holding these prices artificially low, deliberately falsify the signals and throw production into disarray. If a price of gasoline is held down by law, nobody has an incentive to find or produce more gasoline, and consumers have less reason to conserve it. Shortages inevitably appear.
But the task of controlling all prices is mathematically impossible, isn't it? Which perfectly illustrates the futility of central coercion in the economy.
Hazlitt emphasized the sheer scale of the administrative impossibility. It's mind-boggling. To manage a modern economy, the government attempts to fix prices as a response to the inflation it caused. However, he estimated that in the American economy at the time, there were at least 10 million separate prices.
10 million?
And he calculates that this implies something like 50 trillion cross-relationships among all those prices. Think about how the price of steel affects cars, which affects trucking, which affects the price of lettuce.
It's infinite.
It's practically infinite, and these relationships change instantly based on consumer preference, weather, technological breakthroughs, global events. No single bureaucracy, no matter how intelligent or large, could ever manage 50 trillion constantly moving parts. It's an exercise in inevitable failure. You just create chaos.
And managing this failure requires a huge permanent bureaucracy, which then develops a vested interest in expanding the very controls that are failing. Is that the idea?
That's the insidious feedback loop Hazlitt saw. He cites the Department of Agriculture as a prime example of this. This administrative hypertrophy, this bloating. Before crop controls were introduced in 1929, the staff numbered 24,000. By the time he was writing, the staff had ballooned to 120,000.
A five-fold increase.
Yeah. This army of bureaucrats is paid to enforce, expand, and defend the controls, regardless of whether they actually work or just cause shortages and distortions. They become a powerful political lobby for continued intervention for their own jobs.
So Hazlitt's conclusion here is that the true cure for high prices is simply allowing prices to work. Let them be high.
Yes. He states clearly that the cure for high prices is high prices. It sounds counterintuitive maybe, but think about it. A high price incentivizes two beneficial voluntary actions. First, it encourages consumers to be economical in their consumption, maybe find substitutes, reducing demand. And second, it stimulates producers to rush in and supply more of the thing because, hey, high prices mean high potential profits.
So high prices naturally bring prices back down.
Exactly, through voluntary action on both sides. This is the decentralized voluntary coordination that governmental coercion attempts, and inevitably fails, to replace.
Finally, in this section, he looks at consumer protection laws. He argues that interventionist administrations, he specifically names Kennedy and Johnson, operated under this pervading assumption that every problem could be solved by just piling up enough new laws and restrictions.
The legislative reflex. See a problem, pass a law. He finds this approach fundamentally misguided because, in his view, the overwhelming protection for the consumer isn't some new bureaucracy, it's free competition.
How so?
In a free market, the consumer holds all the power. They're the boss, voting with every penny they spend, forcing producers to constantly compete on price, quality, service, innovation, everything. Producers who fail to please the consumer, well, they go out of business.
So layering regulations on producers is ultimately counterproductive to the consumer's actual interest?
Absolutely. Hazlitt argues that harassing the producer with endless regulations only impedes service, raises costs, which get passed on to consumers, and reduces the incentive to innovate and offer better products. The market doesn't need to be managed by a benevolent ruler. It needs to be free enough for competition to flourish, ensuring producers must constantly strive to please the buyer. Interventionism, he implies, assumes the consumer is stupid and the producer is malicious. The free market assumes the consumer is sovereign and the producer is ambitious to serve that sovereign.
This brings us neatly to the core moral hazard Hazlitt identifies in the welfare state. The deliberate erosion, or at least the consequence of eroding individual responsibility. He notes this cruel irony that despite massive growth in general prosperity and measurable declines in actual poverty, relief, and welfare programs only accelerated dramatically.
Yeah, the trend seemed perverse to him. The scale of this acceleration, even back in the late 1960s, was astonishing. Federal welfare outlays alone were estimated at over $68 billion in fiscal year 1969.
$68 billion back then.
And when you include all social welfare expenditures, federal, state, and local, That figure ballooned to over $114 billion. This happened despite the fact that decades earlier, figures like Franklin D. Roosevelt himself had warned that the federal government needed to eventually quit the business of relief. FDR feared it induced spiritual and moral disintegration.
FDR said that. Interesting.
Yeah, Hazlitt quotes him on that. The very architect of the New Deal expressed concerns about long-term federal relief.
So this expansion naturally led to the ultimate policy proposal, the guaranteed income, or sometimes called the negative income tax, NIT. Hazlitt saw this as the ultimate attempt to break the fundamental link between effort, production, and reward, the final step.
He saw it as the ultimate severance, a fatal break. Hazlitt directly challenged proponents of the guaranteed income, like the economist Robert Theobald, who claimed income was an absolute constitutional right that should be guaranteed without conditions.
A right to an income just for existing.
That was the argument. Hazlitt's rebuttal is simple but profound. True income isn't the paper money the government transfers. It's the actual goods and services that money buys. Food, shelter, clothing. These goods and services must be produced by work, by human effort applied to resources. You cannot legislate consumption into existence without legislating production first. To sever the link between production and consumption, he argued, is to guarantee eventual poverty for everyone, because the production eventually dries up.
And the cost estimates for this severance were enormous, even before you factor in how people might change their behavior.
Correct. Initial cost estimates for a guaranteed income, even at a relatively modest level, like $5,000 back then, were projected at $38 billion annually. That's a huge number on top of existing welfare. But Hazlitt correctly pointed out that these estimates were wildly understated. Why? Because they operated under one crucial and he thought frankly absurd assumption.
Which was?
That people receiving the guarantee would continue to work and earn exactly the same amount they earned before they started getting the free money.
Right. Assuming zero change in work effort. That seems unlikely.
Extremely unlikely. Which brings us directly to the incentive trap Hazlitt describes, impacting both the poor who receive the guarantee and the rich, or at least the productive, who pay for it.
Okay, let's start with the poor, or those near the bottom. How does the incentive trap work there?
Hazlitt asked the practical question about human nature, about motivation. Why, he asks, would a married man busting his gut to earn, say, $3,500 a year feel motivated to keep putting in those long, difficult hours? When his next-door neighbor, who perhaps watched television, hung around a bar, or gone fishing, received a guaranteed, no-strings-attached income of $3,400.
The difference is marginal.
Exactly. The system inherently diminishes the reward for work near the poverty line. It actively creates dependence, he argued, rather than alleviating temporary need. Why work for an extra $100?
And on the funding side, for those productive citizens whose wealth is seized via taxes to pay for the system, the rich or middle class, the incentive trap comes via crippling progressive taxation, right?
Precisely. Hazlitt highlights that the high progressive tax rates needed to fund these gargantuan systems actively discourage unusual effort, long hours, risk-taking, capital formation. All the things that actually drive economic growth.
So it's a double whammy. Discourage work at the bottom, discourage effort and investment at the top.
That's the great paradox he saw. You want the most productive people to generate the wealth needed for society, including any safety net, but you punish them the most severely for doing so through steeply progressive taxes.
Now, Hazlitt makes a highly charged claim here, noting that tax rates above 50% raise less than 1% of total income tax revenue, at least at that time. He concludes these high rates are imposed not for revenue, but to satisfy vindictiveness and envy. Isn't that a harsh, highly emotional claim? Surely politicians claim those high rates are needed for progressive revenue, not just spite.
That's a fair challenge, and the language is strong, no doubt. But Hazlitt's point is rooted in the empirical evidence he just provided, or claimed to provide. If the actual revenue generated by the rates above 50% is fiscally negligible, less than 1% of the total take, then the economic effect of keeping those rates high is primarily regulatory and psychological, not revenue generating.
So the argument is, if they don't raise much money, they must serve some other purpose.
Right. Since the rates are ineffective for raising significant capital, their purpose, he argues, must be primarily political. Satisfying a demand for punitive action against the wealthy, appealing to emotions like envy. Hazlitt argues that if the goal were purely maximizing revenue, tax rates would likely be set much lower, at the point that maximizes collection without crippling incentives. The very high rates instead cripple entrepreneurial spirit for very little actual return to the Treasury. That's his logic, harsh as the language might be.
Okay, let's talk about the attempted fix for this incentive problem. the negative income tax, or NIT. This was designed to soften that harsh cliff effect of the guaranteed income, where you lose all benefits if you earn $1 too much. But Hazlitt demonstrates that the arithmetic creates an even more complex, maybe insoluble dilemma.
Yeah, the NIT sounds smarter, doesn't it? It attempts to maintain a slight work incentive by only reducing the government subsidy by a fraction of what is earned. For instance, the common proposal was a $1 subsidy reduction for every $2 earned, a 50% tax back rate on the benefit as you earn more.
Okay, so you keep some incentive.
In theory. But this technical fix immediately runs into one of two catastrophic problems, according to Hazlitt's math.
What is the first problem based on his arithmetic?
The first problem is astronomical cost and serious questions of equity. If the payment for zero income is set at an adequate level, let's use this example of $3,400 for a family back then, the 50% formula dictates that the government must continue paying some subsidy until that family's total earned income reaches double the base amount. In this case, the government would still be paying subsidies until the family income reaches $6,800.
And that figure, $6,800, was dangerously close to the national median income at the time, wasn't it?
Exactly. That's the killer point. This makes the system unjustifiably expensive, forcing the government to subsidize the income of families that are statistically middle class. And it raises serious equity problems. Why should a hardworking family earning, say, $7,000 pay taxes to subsidize their neighbor earning $6,500? The cost just skyrockets beyond all initial projections, and it feels unfair to many taxpayers.
Okay, so that's problem one. Huge cost in subsidizing the middle class. What if the government tries to solve the cost problem by ending the subsidy much sooner, say, right when the worker reaches the adequate income level of $3,400? What fatal disincentive does that create?
That creates the catastrophic cliff effect that the NIT was supposed to prevent in the first place. It brings it right back. Hazlitt illustrates this starkly with a hypothetical scenario. Imagine a worker earning $58 a week. Under the NIT formula with the subsidy phase-out, their total income might be, say, $89. The $58 they earn, plus a $31 subsidy. Now, that worker exerts slightly more effort, gets a tiny raise, and earns $60 a week. If the subsidy is designed to cut off sharply right at the adequate income level, which $60 might represent in this example, that worker would suddenly fall off the subsidy rolls entirely.
And end up with?
They'd end up with only the $60 they earned in total income, a massive net loss of $29 for working slightly harder.
That is an undeniable disincentive. A system that actually punishes people financially for working a little bit more seems guaranteed to create permanent dependence. Why would anyone cross that threshold?
It is the inherent dilemma, Hazlitt argues, of any government-guaranteed income system. You either make it incredibly expensive and subsidize far up the income scale, or you create these vicious notches and cliffs that trap people at lower incomes.
So what's his final take on the NIT?
Hazlitt concludes that the NIT retains the fatal defect of the guaranteed income. It removes the necessity of work for basic survival. It opens the government to massive fraud. I mean, why report extra income if it means a net loss? And it completely neglects the crucial question of why an individual is poor in the first place.
Right, it treats all poverty the same.
Exactly. Is it temporary sickness, lack of education, disability, or simply a refusal to work? The bureaucrat inevitably has to intervene to determine the cause, investigate people's lives, creating an administrative nightmare and further eroding personal liberty and dignity. It just swaps one set of problems for another, potentially worse set.
Hazlitt's critique is not just theoretical. He points to concrete historical examples of where he believes unchecked welfarism leads. He offers Uruguay, once called the Switzerland of Latin America, as the ultimate warning sign.
Uruguay is his cautionary tale, yes. The welfare state gone wild, proving, in his eyes, that once massive benefits are granted, they become politically impossible to reverse, no matter how disastrous the economic consequences.
Why Uruguay specifically? What happened there?
Uruguay adopted a system of pervasive welfarism much earlier and more comprehensively than many other nations. Cradle-to-grave security, incredibly lavish public pensions, massive civil service employment. It was meant to be a socialist paradise.
And the specific tragedies of that collapse, what did Hazlitt highlight?
By the mid-1960s, the statistics he cites were horrific. Something like 40 to 45% of the entire population was entirely dependent on the government for their total income.
Nearly half the country.
Dependent. Nearly 1/5 of the whole population depended on government salaries alone, creating this huge political bloc that could never, ever vote for spending cuts or fiscal responsibility.
Because they'd be voting themselves out of job or benefits.
Precisely. People could retire at the impossibly young age of 45 on full pay completely draining the national treasury. The predictable result was hyperinflation. The cost of living multiplied 32 times in a single decade. 32 times.
Unbelievable. And the political feedback loop Hazlitt identifies here is terrifying because it means the government basically loses all capacity for self-correction. It's locked in.
It becomes a perpetual motion machine of decline. Once benefits are granted and deemed an absolute right, no politician can advocate the necessary austerity required to save the state without committing political suicide. Everyone promises more benefits to get elected.
So the path leads
straight toward runaway inflation, political disorder, capital flight, economic collapse, and ultimately, as happened in Uruguay, a repressive military dictatorship that eventually steps in to try and manage the ensuing chaos and impose order by force. Welfarism, Hazlitt argues, breeds the very instability and coercion it claims to prevent.
This constant expansion of the coercive sector, as he calls it, relies on a crucial semantic trick to conceal its true nature. He specifically challenges the language used by prominent economists of the day, like John Kenneth Galbraith.
Yes, this is a fundamental point about clear thinking and the power of words. Hazlitt insists on correcting the vocabulary to reveal the underlying compulsion.
How so?
What Galbraith and others commonly called the private sector, Hazlitt insists should be called the voluntary sector. Why? Because it consists of the goods and services that people willingly choose to spend their own money on. It's based on free exchange.
Okay, voluntary sector.
And the public sector. Conversely, what Galbraith called the public sector is, in fact, Hazlitt argues, the coercive sector. It consists of goods and services provided only because the government seizes the necessary funds through taxation. You don't have a choice whether to pay for it.
So when commentators argue we need to shift more resources from the private sector to the public sector, what they are effectively arguing, in Hazlitt's terms, is that we need to shift resources from the voluntary economy to the coercive economy.
Exactly. They are advocating for a larger share of the nation's effort, wealth, and decision-making power to be dictated by centralized, compulsory government fiat rather than decentralized, voluntary choice. As the coercive sector grows, the individual inevitably loses the ability to manage their own life, forced to pay for everyone else's education, medical care, retirement through ever higher taxes, rather than having the freedom and the funds to make those crucial choices themselves.
And this coercion, driven by redistribution, represents a basic rejection of private property itself, doesn't it, at a philosophical level?
It's a foundational philosophical rejection, in his view. Hazlitt references Herbert Spencer's 1884 warning in The Man versus the State. Spencer warned of the coming slavery.
Strong words again.
Very. Hazlitt argues that taxing away large portions of income for redistribution is built on the unspoken, and he thought dangerous assumption that society, acting through the government, has an absolute overriding right over the possessions of each individual member. If the state could legitimately seize half or two-thirds or even more of your income to give to others or spend as politicians see fit, then the concept of private property as a fundamental right is already dead, or at least dying. Your property is merely held conditionally at the government's pleasure.
And the sheer volume of governmental interference reinforces this dependence and control. Hazlitt notes the absurdity that the Johnson administration, near its end, counted 435 separate domestic social programs.
That proliferation of laws, agencies, overlapping programs, it results in the government trying to do absolutely everything and, predictably, doing everything badly, inefficiently, and bureaucratically.
But the greatest danger isn't just inefficiency.
No, the greatest danger in Hazlitt's eyes is not even economic collapse, though he saw that as likely, but the ultimate enslavement of the individual's will. He drives this home with a chilling quote from Alexander Hamilton, of all people.
What did Hamilton say?
Hamilton wrote, "Power over a man's subsistence is power over his will."
Power over a man's subsistence is power over his will. That ties the economic freedom, or lack thereof, directly back to political control. If the state guarantees your living, if it controls your subsistence, it effectively owns your loyalty, your compliance, your will.
Precisely. Hazlitt concludes that freedom simply cannot survive without economic discipline, personal foresight, and voluntary cooperation between individuals.
And the welfare state undermines all three.
He argues it systematically replaces them. The unchecked welfare state transforms individual moral and economic responsibility, virtues absolutely necessary for a self-governing people, into pervasive dependence and centralized control. It replaces thrift with reliance on the state and private charity or mutual aid with impersonal bureaucratic handouts. It fundamentally changes the character of the citizenry he feared.
So we have tracked Hazlitt's relentless argument. The road to utopian compassion, however well-intentioned, is paved with the coercion of government spending, price and wage controls, and massive taxation. These tools, designed perhaps for societal salvation, only destroy, in his view, the voluntary effort, the economic discipline, and the individual virtue required for true, sustainable progress and liberty.
And this leads directly to Hazlitt's ultimate strategic conclusion, which is quite focused. He believed the single most effective issue libertarians, or anyone concerned about this trend, could concentrate on was demanding an honest currency and halting inflation.
Halting inflation, that's the linchpin.
That was his strategic bottleneck. Why? Because if you could halt the rapid chronic increase in the money supply, the engine we discussed earlier, you would effectively stop the chronic budget deficits.
Because they couldn't print the difference anymore.
Right. Halting chronic deficits would, by necessity, halt the rapid increase in welfare spending and consequently halt the constant aggressive increase in government power and coercion across the board. It's a single point of attack against the entire coercive structure he described. Control the money, control the spending, control the power.
It certainly simplifies a massive political problem down to a single, though very difficult, question of fiscal and monetary discipline. But let me leave you, our listener, with this final provocative thought, building on Hazlitt's analysis of moral responsibility. Hazlitt insists that true charity, true community, true progress arise from individuals and voluntary associations, not vast, unaccountable bureaucracies. If we continue to accept the premise that the state must replace voluntary efforts for security, for old age, for unemployment, for helping the poor, what specific virtues essential to a free and functioning society, are we allowing to erode, perhaps without even noticing? Are we sacrificing self-reliance, foresight, personal responsibility, maybe even compassion fatigue as it becomes just another tax? Are we trading these for guaranteed government-mandated dependence? That is the moral reckoning Hazlitt demands we face. And whether you agree with him or not, it remains acutely relevant today.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.